So this is the Religion in Brandon Sanderson panel. We've got ourselves nice and warmed up. So we'll just go through. If you could quickly just give me who you are and what you do, and we'll jump into questions. We'll start back at the top. Brittany, if you could start us off.
Yeah, I'm Brittany Passmore. I'm a freelance editor. I love working with sci-fi and fantasy, do lots of different kinds of editing, and I am a big Brandon Sanderson fan.
I am an author of science fiction and fantasy. I have some short stories published in Beneath Ceaseless Skies, Podcastle, and have one forthcoming from Fantasy Magazine.
Perfect, thank you. And Michael?
Yeah, I'm also a fantasy author. I have a few novels, novel series I've released. I also do poetry and lyrics and have a couple podcasts. And love Sanderson. He's great.
Perfect, thank you. And Stan?
I've written a number of clean romances, a few cozy mysteries, science fiction anthology, currently working on the first of a series in a YA fantasy sci-fi mashup. And of course, I am also a big Sanderson fan.
Perfect. Now, we will back up a bit and I think we can kind of briefly touch over our big points here. So first question I had put out was, how did Sanderson portray religion in his works, and how does he use that to tell stories? So if we could just kind of skim over that, we can get back to where we were. I think that'd be appreciated with the reduced time.
One thing I mentioned just briefly is that he really uses it to show who his characters are, especially as people learn new things about the religion or as theology changes and people have to grapple with these new ideas. You really get a sense of who these characters are because of what they believe and how they interact.
I'd mentioned how it was he uses it also as a way to create tension between both individual characters and also different societies. And the point that there's the established Orthodox religions, and then he brings in the rise of new ones based around, different heroic characters, and that is great drama.
Yeah, I just love the way that Brandon approaches religion with an incredible amount of complexity and empathy. And he has expressed his approach in numerous interviews where he has talked about how his hope is that people who come from different religious viewpoints, whether they be theist or atheist, something analogous to the viewpoints to his characters, he hopes that people will be able to see themselves in that and feel that he got it right and be happy that he represented their viewpoint. And if you go on Reddit, you see this actually happen every few days. Someone comes onto Reddit and says, oh my gosh, like I thought that Brandon was, X or Y, and I found out that he is actually, a member of this church, and they'll be so surprised because he had them convinced, because he was so well able to situate himself in the viewpoint that was not his own.
Pretty much sums it up, yeah.
Yeah, I think we covered our points we hit here. The second question that we went over was that Sanderson's well known for world building. How does his world building affect how he uses religion, whether it be in the construction or in how people worship?
So I'll bring up the point again about the Cosmere, about how the Cosmere is a collection of places and how the interplay between those places can change the viewpoints of the different characters on individual worlds, as I find out that beings that they thought were deities may not actually be deities or are a different type of deity than they had previously believed.
Absolutely. I had made the point previously that it is amazing to me how Brandon not only has culture and religion stem from his environment, but how culture and religion in turn affect his environments on a global and planetary scale, and how we can see that in our own world as cultures at large have certain values or beliefs about their stewardship or lordship over the land, how it was created or how it formed, whether or not species can die off, and how all of these values can end up changing things on an absolutely cosmic scale. The way that we war, the way that we create pollution is grandly affected by those things. And he shows that in his books.
And I had commented on that, just how that in the Stormward like archive, the Spren very much represent that, where some people think, hey, it's okay to, we're the lords of them. We can use them to create our devices and take their powers. And other people are like, whoa, that's horrible. Why are you doing that? And that, that illustrates your point.
And then I just mentioned also that I love how his religion is really integrated with a lot of aspects. For instance, the magic system usually influences the religion. Actually, one thing that I find so fascinating is in Warbreaker, the whole magic system of being able to breath and like be, I can't reborn or whatever, returned. That's what it is. This whole idea that somebody can like become a deity off of that, but it's also like a lot of there's just so many like moral questions about this whole breath magic system, and it's very interesting how the magic and the religion really come together to make really interesting.
Yeah,
who'd have ever thought the breath mints could be a moral question?
So, something that's been touched on by, I think, every panelist at this point, just very briefly, is the idea that in the Cosmere, the reader has some knowledge about what is and isn't divine. And the characters don't. And they learn it, and sometimes they miss the point. But we're dealing with a universe in which there is an objective truth. And that is kind of unusual to have this much detail about religion in a place where there are physical deity. How does Sanderson handle this, and what have you liked or found interesting about these kinds of settings?
What I would say first to that is I like the fact that that Brandon has made his deities. He's humanized them in a lot of ways, and I'm not talking necessarily like Greek god type humanized, but although some of the deities are can be petty, but he really gets into the whole idea of apotheosis. The idea that a mortal being can somehow become a god. You see that very much in the Mistborn series. There are hints of that throughout Stormlight Archives, etc. And I think that's one of the things that makes it so appealing to readers, or at least to me, because there's this idea that despite our flaws and despite that we goof things up, that somehow we can still transcend those flaws, and somehow we can still be entrusted with this enormous amount of power. Certainly, Sazed, I don't know how that's pronounced. He even goes through a crisis of faith where he ends up rejecting all religions, and yet he goes on to basically, literally save his world.
I'm unfortunately the hero of ages.
Yes.
Yeah,
I think that Brandon.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, the lag. I think that Brandon very well represents. Michael, you used the word lens earlier in the discussion, and I think that he understands the nature of metaphor and the need for framework that humans apply to the phenomenon that they experience, whether particularly when they don't have explanations. And so I think that it's very artfully done that he would show that sometimes those metaphors work, sometimes they don't. None of them are perfect. But I do believe it's a little bit unfair that as the reader, we know who's right or wrong. To me, that takes me a little bit out of the human experience, because in the human experience, we observe these things, we see these things, we are obliged to empathize with things, and we don't know who is right at the end of the day. So there's a little bit of a cheat for the reader, but it's okay, I'll forgive it.
Yeah.
But kind of going along those lines, I think it's so interesting that Sanderson doesn't try to make all of his characters and people understand what is right. For instance, when Sazed becomes this sort of deity in his own right, and he's sort of in the Alloy of Law series, becomes his own god and religion, he never pressures anybody else to follow that religion. He's like, I just want you guys to be good people and believe what you want. And I just love how he's not going on this whole campaign like, everybody in the Cosmere must be converted to like what is right. He really lets people explore and find their own faith. And I think that's really showing of how our world really works. Even though there are lots of people trying to like convert people to other religions, everybody really has their own path and makes their own choices of what is true.
And it's interesting to see some people when they're presented with more information, they still cling to like, no, it's, in the Stormlight Archive, we have this whole thing, is the Almighty dead or is he not? Some people are like, no, I still believe. Despite evidence to the contrary, I cling to that because that's all I know and all I have. And other people, when presented with new evidence, they said, okay, you know what? I'm going to align my thinking. And that is such an interesting dynamic that you see in a lot of his books, is that some people are able to change their minds and some people just will not and cannot. Very much like real life.
Yeah. Sanderson is not only does he write religions that very well reflect his world, but they do take elements from our world and from real world religions.
Absolutely.
You can look at the countless Christian analogs in survivorism and a lot of those discussions. But are there any that are maybe less familiar to a standard American audience that you noticed that you would like to gush about?
Without getting too much into spoilers on Rhythm of War, I will say I like how he does go into greater depth on the singers' religion and their gods. I like kind of the what strikes me as probably an accurate reflection of tribalist societies that he portrays in Rhythm of War, and how their whole existence of that group is in direct consequence of their past relations with their deities. And that has led them down a path that a lot of their other people hadn't gone. And so just looking at the notion of a people who had utterly rejected their gods because their gods were bad to them, at least, I think that's probably a little less familiar to Americans. Well, maybe not. Maybe it's just less familiar to me. But
well, and it's also interesting how in the same world they have both the religions have the notion of, okay, you only have one life and you die and there's this beautiful heaven-like place. You go to the Tranquiline halls when we die. And then on the other hand, we have the singers it's more like the religions that believe in reincarnation. And in this case, they literally do that come back. So the fused and whatnot, but we have both the reincarnation ideas and the more like Judeo-Christian ideas of, okay, you've got one life, and then if you're good, you there's a place for you, and if you're bad, there's another place for you. It's interesting how those coexist.
Mm-hmm. I think that the Spren are a quick analog to animism. And I have not done an extensive research into the worldwide religions that would go into this. It's a fascinating question. But I would suspect that I know Brandon served a mission for his church in Korea, I believe. And I would suspect that a lot of his heart would lie there as well, because Shintoism, for instance, is an animistic spiritist religion, which is not Korean, but Japanese as far as I know. But I think it shares a lot of things there. I think that Brandon brings a really unique perspective on missionary work. In Elantris, I was so impressed with the representation of some of the mentalities that go into missionary work. I think Hrathen is one of the finest religious villains that I have ever read. And it very obviously comes from his very specific experience serving his mission. I am currently an atheist, but I did serve a mission at one point. And so I related very strongly to Hrathen's despair at his feeling of disconnection between himself and his deity, his disillusionment with his religion. And then also Sazed's a missionary as well, as Sazed presents religions to people and tries to get them to convert, and very quickly learns what does not work, and then what does eventually. So I think that while that may not be a religion outside of the states per se, it is still a very unique experience. There aren't very many people in this world who spend a year and a half or 2 years, day in and day out, devoted to proselyting their belief system. And I love that Brandon brings that into multiple stories.
I also wanted to mention, I know one idea at least that he has been fascinated with is the idea that like a god figure can be like a king, and what happens if your god king dies, and how does that affect you? Like, do you still believe he's God? So he has a couple different cultures that have some sort of system like that. And I know in Stormlight we haven't like seen that in person as much. We kind of see it in Moorbreaker, but I know he's been interested in that idea, and I believe that idea comes more from like an Asian root usually. So that's another kind of unique aspect that he brings in. I think he really does try to pull from a lot of different cultures. I heard him once say in an interview that he's most interested in like the religion or culture that he doesn't know about yet, and he really does like to explore these different ideas.
Yeah, I think this is good. Go ahead, Michael.
Oh, I was just saying that when you're talking about the God King, it reminded me a little bit of that sort of the Egyptian pantheon, and how they while the pharaoh was there, he was God to them for a little while. And there's both the Egyptian and sort of the Greek pantheon. You kind of feel a little bit, you're taking a little bit from there, where the gods aren't all benevolent. They do horrible things sometimes to each other and to mortals. You can definitely see those influences.
And it goes beyond the Egyptian pantheon. A lot of ancient religions had that notion that the king had some sort of divine investiture and was either a representative of their god or was a god himself or herself in the case of a queen.
I'm just laughing at the use of the word investiture. It's just entirely inappropriate. But...
Yeah. Yeah.
It was intentional.
So another question I had here is, religion in Sanderson's works isn't just limited to a societal construct or a cultural construct. It is a very real part of character motivation and a real part of character conflict. I cannot think of many characters heroically presented who have been disdained for their religion in narrative. Now, there are characters who certainly disagree or have contrasting viewpoints, but it tends to be handled very sympathetically. How do you what are your relationships or your experiences with his multiple viewpoints? How has that colored your readings?
Well, similar to what Christine said, I actually spent time as a missionary as well. And I was exposed to a lot of different viewpoints, various religions, various lack of religion. And by the time I was done, one of the many things I concluded on was that I care less about what someone believes than I do about how well they know what they believe, know why they believe it, and how well they adhere to their beliefs. And so when I read Brandon's works, that's what really appeals to me, because I can't tell you how many people I met that said, oh, I'm insert religion here, but their lives did not seem to reflect those teachings at all. And that still kind of grates on me to this day. But if someone comes to me and they have a very different viewpoint than me, but they understand why they have that viewpoint and they articulate it and it actually drives their lives, I'm good with that. And we see that in Brandon's characters. There are people, of course, that are just kind of drifting and they're like, I'm insert religion here, pick one from the Cosmere, and they just kind of go on with things. But a lot of them really do have a conviction in their faith, and it really does motivate them. And that is, again, as we said, what creates that tension and that conflict between the characters.
Yeah, I was a missionary in Germany, and I thought I saw a lot of that similar thing where people say, "Oh yeah, I'm Catholic," or "I'm Protestant," or whatever, and it was more like the religion to them had become more of a culture or a tradition than an actual religion. They had, for example, they had all of these religious holidays. Like, you get off work for this, and it was just a really, really old Catholic holiday. And you ask somebody, hey, well, what are we celebrating today? And they're like, I don't know, it's June 22nd, whatever. It's some old feast day, you know? I feel like, yeah, you see that a little bit too, where some people are just kind of going through the motions because that's just what you do. You know, you go, it's Easter, you go to the church and once a year, you know, whatever.
But I think it's interesting that we also see that viewpoint in Sanderson's books, because there are people who are like, oh yeah, I worship the Almighty, but they don't necessarily like not everybody has to burn a prayer, you know, and a lot of people, they kind of feel like the ardent worship for them, you know. There's an interesting kind of reflection of like all those viewpoints are reflected in the Cosmere as well.
Yeah, absolutely. There was an interview that I watched where Brandon was talking about how his belief is that we come to the truth not by tearing down each other's weakest arguments or the straw men that we can create for them, but by engaging with each other's best arguments. And I feel like that is reflected in these characters. From each of these viewpoints, we have characters who may not be the most devout, like Kelsier's relationship with the gods is questionable, but but whatever they do, they do it well. Like they are all in whatever it is that their interpretation is, and in that way, they present their best argument. A lot of atheists are very happy with the representation of Yasna because of the arguments that she presents. Like, Brandon is not making her look like an idiot by having her present straw man arguments that other characters can just dismiss, or even the reader, because the things that she says are still worth saying, even with the reader's knowledge of what the larger reality is. And so that to me is it's a very valuable thing that there would be good arguments from so many perspectives. I would say that Sazed's arguments for faith are just as strong as Yasna's arguments for atheism, which it's a shame they don't get to have an argument with each other. That would be amazing.
You've got 6 more Stormlight books. Hold on.
Well, Dalinar though, and I'm not gonna throw any spoilers, Christine, but the Dalinar and Yasna scene. I'm assuming you've read Rhythm of War.
I have not read Rhythm of War.
Anyway, if you have not read it, that's okay. There is a scene where Dalinar and Yasna are interacting, and he asks her to counterbalance him in his views, and he recognizes that he is kind of a heretic himself. He mentions that in his own writings in Oathbringer, but he goes to her, and I love the fact that he does that because it makes Dalinar a stronger character in my viewpoint. That even though he has interacted with, he's very deeply invested in his faith, even though he's considered a heretic, he's still a religious person. But he looks at Yasna and he's like, "Look, I need you to give another context to what I have written, so that other people, when they're reading this, they're not just getting what I say." And so I love that he did that because, yeah, you're right. She really does have some fantastic arguments, and it does round things out. It does balance them nicely.
I just to throw a small comment in. I found a lot of his portrayals, particularly of characters in conflict with family. I mean, Navani and Yasna have very radically different viewpoints, but all of their interactions are based on a mutual respect and a mutual understanding, and frankly, a familial love that transcends what is clearly a divide that neither of them are entirely comfortable with. You know, you don't get this idea in their conversations that they're both super happy with where the other one's at, but, you know, family first. And I think those kinds of relationships and discussions that he has, where faith is always important to the characters who have it, whatever they believe, it has to be important to them. But, you know, it's a value. It's not these are not theological treatises. These are stories about people. And I've always found that tremendously humanizing. I think I want to kick it over to questions from the audience now, to give us a few minutes at the end to wrap up. So if our volunteer could let us know.
Alrighty. In that case, the first question will be from Elise, and she asks, how do you write religion in your books without getting your own faith mixed up in being fantasy?
Can I actually field that one real quick?
Sure.
Okay. I'm going to just quote Brandon briefly, or I might paraphrase. I actually got, this is from him. He says, when I asked him about his faith, he says, this is a surprisingly common question for people to ask me. I'm always happy to answer it because my religion makes up a big part of who I am. He goes on to say that he believes that the misuse of religion is a great evil, and that use of religion for good reasons is a good thing. He goes on to say, I don't actually sit down and write books wanting to advocate any particular concept. I feel that when I write books, I need to advocate whatever the character believes at the time. Now, what I feel is heroic may shape the characters I create as protagonists, but I don't think that the purpose of fiction that I write is to preach directly to the reader. So Brandon definitely has his own religious viewpoints, but his focus, as he said in the email response, is on the character. And as writers, we must know our characters well if we are to write them well. And sometimes that will mean setting aside our own views and our own beliefs. I'm sure Brandon has heard all of the arguments that Yasna presents. I don't know that he agrees with any, maybe he does, but he does seem to understand them, and he understands the value of them. And so he is able to present a clearly atheistic character in a compelling way that there's not some hint that she's like doubting herself or anything like that. When if you were to speak to him about religion personally, he would probably tell you a very different story than she does. So it's just, if we focus on the characters as writers, if we set aside our views and try to put ourselves in their place, I believe that's probably one of the best ways to not get our views too entangled in their stories.
I think also you don't have to entirely avoid inserting your own viewpoints into your story, in the sense that it is okay to put things in that you think and then to just shave off those serial numbers. While the Spren have ties to animism, I think that they also have ties to the LDS belief that all matter is intelligence or has intelligence.
Yeah.
And like, if you know what to look for and you're reading Brandon's work, his viewpoints come through loud and clear. And while I think that he presents complex arguments, I think that the series is definitely slanted a certain way in favor of his viewpoints. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all. He's not preaching, but it's coming through. And I mean, really, your viewpoints and your values are what you have to share with the world, and they should come through with your writing. So, yeah, I mean, you don't want to make it too obvious, but it's okay.
Yeah, I think as long as it's done in an organic way. I read a book recently where you go along in the narrative, and all of a sudden, like, there's this like big like dump of this is how I feel about this, and you're like, it totally takes you out of the story, and it's like, why are we doing this? Like, you know that this is going to turn people off. Why did you include this? But I think Brandon is very good at doing it, like you said, in a very natural way, where you can kind of tell where his heart is, but he's not beating you over the head with it or saying, making it look like it's the only way to think.
All right. If no one else has any comments, we can take the next question.
Alrighty. In that case, Sarah Bartholomew has the question, what are some of your favorite religions or characters interacting with religion in his works?
All of them. I have a lot of different things that I'm really fascinated by. I think one of my favorite examples, though, is just watching Sazed's development.
Sazed's awesome.
Yeah, just like Christine mentioned before, his going through all these different religions. He kind of goes from a missionary to trying to find out for himself what the truth is, and he kind of gets hopeless, and then he kind of has his own deity experience, and it's just so interesting to see his religious journey and how faith impacts him. So that's something that I've always just loved how he handled that. I just think it's so interesting, all the different things that he goes through and discovers.
I really like how with Dalinar, or he bonds the Stormfather to him, the people have worshipped, and how it's interesting how Dalinar tries to change the Stormfather. And the Stormfather is saying, no, that this is how I am. You can't change me. And there's this tension of they're trying to influence each other to become a certain way. And I think that's a really interesting thing to think about. Like, like depending on most religions, it's like the deity is here, you listen, and you take on the will. But he's actually like trying to push back and influence the deity as well. That's a really interesting dynamic.
I already waxed poetic about Wraith, and but I also really just enjoy the entirety of the treatment of Kelsier. It's just wonderful. It's fantastic. It says so much about the character, the world, but also just the way people think and the way that devotion can arise. And it's interesting that there is so much of Kelsier that does continue and is divine, but that's not the story that people worship. That's not the figure that they believe in. People are actually completely unaware of that. And what they have is this memory and this archetype that they have created out of him. And that is the religion. And the reality is actually so far beyond their comprehension. Very interesting.
Well, especially since
an ideal.
Yeah, especially since Spook kind of gets caught up in that, and he's very much not what you'd consider a religious icon throughout most of the Mistborn series, and yet somehow he ends up as somewhat of a central figure in, the Church of the Survivors. So,
all right. I think we have time for just one question if we go kind of rapid fire, and then we'll have time to just do our where you can find us and that sort of thing. So get the last question.
Best EVA asks, is the god of the Iriali the one Sanderson, since they believe every character in the Cosmere comes from the one?
Maybe?
I don't think the Iriali would make that connection, but I think in reality that probably is the truth.
Well, he does hint at Adonasium throughout various books, and so there is there are snippets that say that there is basically one supreme original deity that invested everything else. But whether that's the god of the Iriali or not, I'm not yet sure.
It's a bit of a semantics question. If someone says something believing one result when they're technically correct in a whole other sense, is that are they right?
Sort of.
Yeah.
So my phone Brandon real quick.
Hey.
Yeah, sorry. Can we get him on there?
I'm sure we could stop by his office. He's teaching this semester.
Probably yeah, there you go.
All right. I think if we'd like to go back through, we'll go bottom to top. If you could just let everyone know where your next panel will be, and where they can find any of your work. We'll start with you, Stan.
Okay, this is actually my last panel for this year. You find my work on Amazon, BarnesandNoble.com, Smashwords, etc. And yeah, feel free to look me up.
Perfect. Michael?
You bet. I do have a big Facebook presence under Books by Michael Young. My two podcasts that I'm currently doing are Chapter and Verse and Songs for All Seasons. So I'm also a musician. And my latest release was The Hunger, and I will be making that into a trilogy this year. You can find that on Amazon.
Perfect. All right. Go ahead.
You can find me at christinetyler.com. And you can read my work. Let's see. The two stories I have out are The Horrible Deaths of Helga Raffensdatter at Podcastle, which is also audio. And they had an Icelandic narrator read it. So I actually really recommend that. And then My Sister's Wings Are Red at Beneath Ceaseless Skies.
All right. Perfect. And Brittany?
Yeah, I have a website. I'll put the link in the chat, and I can also put like Twitter and Instagram and Facebook stuff in there too. And then I also have a panel that I'm doing at 11 in the Anne McCaffrey room. It's about developmental editing. I'm moderating it, so you'll learn all about what developmental editing is, how you can find those editors, when you need them, all that good stuff.
Perfect. And my name is Dylan Parker. I'll be here. I will not here, actually. It'll be in the Gygax room for Intro to RPGs at 7 o'clock. You can find me on Puckle, PUCL podcast, long-running Pokemon podcast, as well as my personal editing company you can find at chapter1editing.com. Currently open for manuscript submissions. So if you have anything, you can send my way. With that, I think we will be closing just a few 30 seconds or so early. Thank you very much for attending, and I hope the rest of your convention is enlightening.